Over the span of 12 days, Israel and Iran launched attacks at each other, bringing us headlines like we'd never seen before. Unfortunately, we had gotten used to seeing bodies and destroyed buildings in Gaza for the past 2 years. But ultimately, a line was crossed, a line that everybody had warned against. In Iran, nuclear and military assets were hit, and in Israel, air bases and government complexes were targeted. But civilians, as always, paid the price. For now, a ceasefire seems to have taken effect, and a sense of cautious relief is finally setting in. But as we slow down and try to piece together these incredible events, the big question is, how did we get here in the first place? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In this episode, we pause for a moment to understand what brought Israel and Iran here. How did their relationship change from one of diplomacy and alliance to one that only two sworn enemies can have? Where did it all go wrong? Before we dive into the context, let's recap what happened exactly between Israel and Iran. I'm here with Aveen Karim, Assistant Foreign Editor at The National, to break down the sequence of events from those very early moments. Aveen, you were on shift on Friday morning, the 13th of June. What were those few first hours like when Israel struck Iran? What happened, basically?
So I remember actually the day before, we were questioning whether it would actually happen because on the Thursday, we were handling the news that the US was evacuating its embassy in Baghdad and some of its bases around the region. And we were not sure if that was a way of the US putting pressure on Iran ahead of the talks that were scheduled for Sunday, or whether something was actually going to happen. So on Friday morning, actually, when I woke up to get ready for my shift, which was around like 5:45, 5:50, I checked my phone and I saw what happened. I don't know what I wore to work. I just got dressed and left to the office. And then we were just covering it almost robotic, I think, for the first few hours until it really settled in. And we realized that this was not just another attack like we saw in April and October last year, where they traded a few attacks and that was it. This was actually looking like a war. And we saw destruction in both Iranian cities and Israeli cities that I haven't seen in my lifetime before.
So it didn't just last for 13 days with just Israel and Iran exchanging fire. There was also a US angle. What is that?
That was also a key, like one of the turning points, actually, where I thought after the US strikes, it would get even worse. And especially after Iran retaliated, I didn't think we would have a ceasefire immediately after that. Like, I thought, okay, this is where the region could potentially be dragged in. But definitely the US strike on Iran, again, that's unprecedented. But I guess, that sort of leads us to where we are today, where there is this question of what did the US strike and where is Iran's nuclear program? Where is the enriched uranium that they've been saying that Iran has?
Because it depends on who you ask, right? On one hand, there are reports that the US did not cause extensive damage, but the US president has denied those reports. And then we saw, of course, as you said, Iran striking the US base in Qatar, which is something you and I were talking about the day before it happened. We were saying, surely not Qatar, right? Because they're so closely tied. So do you think that everyone just wanted to get things out of their system? They got things out of their system.
It's a very strange doctrine that Trump has, this idea of peace through strength. I guess that was his attempt of peace through strength. As strange as that sounds, he did his bit. He launched his strikes. He said he destroyed, and he's very adamant that he has destroyed Iran's nuclear program. And for him, that was it. That was the job done. The war is over. There's no need for anyone to continue anymore. But of course, if you put yourself in Iran's position, you have the US president saying that he's destroyed all your nuclear facilities and capabilities. You have to respond in order to show that you are the country that you say you are and you have the strength that you say you have, but also to your people. They need to see you respond. So it was clear that it was most likely going to be a US base in the region. And yeah, like you said, Qatar has good relations with Iran. But then again, it is hosting the largest US base in the region. So it was a symbolic attack. Trump said he was informed beforehand, so there was no damage caused. Qatar said it had thwarted the attack, so everything was intercepted. And also you saw after that happened, Obviously, rightly so, Qatar issued condemnation and said that it was an attack on its sovereignty. And immediately after that, you had a flurry of diplomacy from Iran's side with Qatar, but also with other Gulf countries. And then after that, we had a ceasefire. So it seems, at the moment at least, that maybe that was it.
Tell us about the ceasefire.
So the ceasefire itself was very confusing in many ways. Trump announced it himself. As soon as the announcement happened, Israel struck Tehran. It said it struck the IRGC and the Basij. And then a few hours later, you had Iran launching 6 waves of missiles at Israel, which killed 4 people. Then after that, Netanyahu's office issued a statement saying, yes, we accept Trump's proposals. Iran had not officially said there was a ceasefire. It was just Iranian state TV at that point, but no officials had come out to say that there had indeed been a ceasefire.
The Israeli and Iranian attacks against each other after the president's announcement of a ceasefire came before the ceasefire was supposed to go into effect, right?
Yeah. So the ceasefire was supposed to come into effect at a certain time. So both sides, I guess, got in their last waves of attacks right before that. However, after the time of the ceasefire came into effect, Israel then came out and said Iran had violated it and launched missiles, which Iran denied. And then right after that was when Israel vowed to retaliate. But I think maybe that's when Trump also woke up for the day and issued a series of social media posts in caps lock where he was saying, Israel, don't drop those bombs. And it was very much directed towards Israel more than Iran. And then afterwards, he was speaking to reporters and he also said he's very unhappy with both of them, especially with Israel. And he just basically urged restraint. Israel still responded by launching a strike on Iran, but it was quite contained.
And now both sides are declaring victory.
Of course, yeah. It's hard to measure victory in a case like this. I mean, Trump thinks he's victorious because he destroyed the nuclear program and he brokered the ceasefire. And Israel is claiming victory because the goal they always stated they had was to destroy the nuclear program or to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. So they claim that this has happened and it has achieved its war goals. Whereas Iran claims victory, I guess, because the regime still stands in place. But there has been heavy destruction on both sides. The main thing out of all of this is it's the first time we see them attack each other. No proxies involved. They very much stayed on the sidelines because until now, their conflicts were always played out in other countries in the region. But yeah, it's hard to measure success because we don't know what actually happened to the nuclear program.
Iran's nuclear program has been the subject of controversy and tension for years, so this is not especially new. But the question is, why? Why now? And why does not only the US care so much, but Israel too? To answer this question, we have to go back in time a little bit, because what many people may not realize is that Israel and Iran were not always the enemies that they are today. Dalia Dastakay is a senior fellow at UCLA Berkel Center for International Relations. She's also the author of the upcoming book, Enduring Hostility: The Making of America's Iran Policy. We discuss the origins of the Israel-Iran relationship and how it has soured over time. So how far back do we have to go to understand this relationship better and its evolution into what it has become today?
It goes back even before the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Israel had a very close relationship with the Shah regime of Iran, a secular monarchy. There was arms relationship, oil, and so forth. So it was a warm relationship, not without complications. The arms component was probably the most significant factor. Israel's interest in Iranian oil and the Iran government's interest in Israeli arms. But there was sensitivity. I mean, at the time, Israel was still occupying Palestinian territory, which is still the case today. If you're talking about the kind of heyday of Israeli-Iranian relations under the Shah in the 70s, and for that matter, US-Iran relations, this was after the 1967 war. So Israel at that point was occupying the West Bank. And it's not that there wasn't sensitivities, but there was a sense that there was common interest between the Iranian government and the Israeli government. They were part of the peripheral states, the non-Arab part of the region, and they had similar outlooks in terms of the Arab neighborhood, opposition to Arab nationalism. There was, I think, a constellation of forces that kind of drew them together. But there was always, in terms of domestic sentiment, some issues about how Israelis were dealing with the Palestinians, but that was really not considered the primary factor. And so I think that's why it was pretty common knowledge that this was a pretty robust relationship, but more based on transnational and geostrategic interests than common values or so forth.
What was the first turning point that really turned this into a defined divorce, let's say?
The defined divorce is most definitely the 1979 revolution. I mean, before that, there was, again, it wasn't a formal diplomatic relationship, but there was a de facto Israeli diplomatic presence / embassy in Tehran and so forth. Israel, because of its association with the Shah and arms and its repressive government, the revolutionaries did not look well upon Israel. And so there was a very strong anti-Israel, anti-Western sentiment among the revolutionaries in Iran. And of course, you have the US hostage crisis and the erosion of the US Iranian relationship, which had also been very strong before the revolution. The main difference, 1979 was the big breaking point in terms of anything that was out in the open in terms of the Israeli Iranian relationship, which was pretty well understood to be robust. After 1979, it became completely covert. So, for example, in the 1980s, even though Iran and Israel became at that point enemies, during that time, the primary threat to Israel was Iraq. And so, because Israel was more concerned with Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the 1980s, and throughout the 80s, the Iranians and Iraqis were fighting a very vicious war. The Israelis actually, despite the ideological rift and the anti-Israel sentiment among the new leadership in Iran, the Israelis and the Iranians actually cooperated, and Israel facilitated arms sales to the Islamic regime. So I think sometimes it's a little too simplistic to put it all down to ideology. National interests were also driving the relationship. But that's, I think, a key point that yes, the 1979 revolution was transformative, but there were other factors at play. And the next key turning point was when the Iraq threat was no longer a factor for Israel, the demise of Saddam Hussein, and we see a real shift starting in the 1990s.
What was happening at the time in the region? What was it about that decade that became another turning point in the relationship, and how did it play into that?
When we enter the decade of the 90s, this is the time when the threat from Saddam Hussein, it's not gone. Of course, he's not overthrown until 2003 in the US invasion of Iraq. But you had the first Persian Gulf War, where August 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. And so there was a big international effort led by the United States to roll back Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. And over the 90s, Saddam Hussein was more or less contained. So Iraq was no longer, from the Israeli perspective, viewed as the big threat. And so, given that, who were the major powers in the region? Iran, Iraq. And so all eyes start turning to Iran. And so that is when you start hearing more Israeli leaders focusing on Iran. And the second major factor, I think, was the Middle East peace process. So the 90s are the era of Arab-Israeli peacemaking. You have the Madrid conference that comes in the aftermath of the first Iraq war in 1991. And then you have the Oslo Accords in 1993. But the view was, at the time, from the Israeli perspective, was let's deal with the Palestinians first, our near enemy, and then we can deal with our far enemies like Iran. So it wasn't at the forefront of the mind of Israeli leaderships at the time, but the threat started to increase. And then by the late 1990s, when the peace process really goes south and you have a deterioration of Oslo, the Iranians were sidelined out of most of the process. The Iranians at that point were basically backing and even creating, in the case of Hezbollah, resistance proxies, right? Non-state militia groups. That was part of Iran's strategy: keep war off our territory, resist the West, resist the Israelis. And that is when the Iranians are associated with a number of major terrorist acts in the late 90s that really scuttle the peace process. And then you get the rise of Bibi Netanyahu. And nobody in Israel focused on Iran like Bibi Netanyahu. And he has now been prime minister of Israel for over 17 years. And then the final factor in the 90s is growing attention to the nuclear threat, not like it has been over the last 2 decades, but it starts moving onto the radar.
How did the concerns change from Iran's proxies, which were sort of front and center, to its nuclear program as being the main issue?
From the Israeli perspective, the two issues go hand in hand. From the regional perspective, the bigger concern is the militant groups, much more than Iran nuclear program. That's not a concern, but it's what Iran was doing in the broader region, especially after the 2003 Iraq war. I wouldn't say the nuclear overshadows the proxies because they go hand in hand. And really from the early 2000s, both of those issues really escalate. And so the 2003 Iraq war was another big turning point. And that was a turning point in terms of a conventional perspective across the region. Was this was a win for Iran. The fall of Saddam Hussein means there was no more major Arab power pushing back against Iran. And the idea was that Iran was able to capitalize on the chaos after. But then in conjunction with that, you have an exposure of Iranian nuclear facilities starting in the early 2000s that really start to draw not just Israeli, but international alarm about the nuclear issue. The Europeans get very active in trying to negotiate to contain this issue. The Bush administration, even in this second term, tries to get some multilateral support to contain the Iranian nuclear program. So it's no longer just an Israeli issue. And then you get to the point by 2011 and 12 where there's a very serious threat of an Israeli military strike on Iran. So none of this of what we're seeing today is particularly new, although new red lines have been crossed.
Can you bring us into the present? How did we get from that post-Iraq war era in the 2000s to these new red lines that we've seen have been crossed?
The most interesting thing about the Israel-Iran tensions is how it's really morphed quite a bit just in the last 15 years. All of this focus on the proxies and the nuclear led to this shadow war between Israel and Iran for so many years, where each side was fighting kind of behind the scenes. But what's interesting about that is, why did it move from the shadows to this overt war today? And for so many years, both Israel and Iran had very strong motivations to keep fights off their territory. Iran never wanted to drag or involve the United States. Iran always understood Israel was far superior conventionally. And the Israelis equally were very interested in trying to degrade the Iranian threat, nuclear and otherwise, with attacks on and sabotage on nuclear programs, scientists, even military sites. But they didn't ever take responsibility for these attacks because each side wanted to give the other side some kind of cover so that they would not have to escalate too far. And if we're talking about turning points, then the Hamas attack on Israel was the most critical turning point that brought this shadow war right out into the open. But what's clear now from these starting on June 13th attack by Israel is that now we're not just out of the shadow war into open warfare, but Israel's risk tolerance is much higher in a post-October 7th environment. It does seem, in terms of Israeli targeting and messaging, that they were not just going for Iran's nuclear sites, they were going to destabilize the country itself and the regime. We're entering a new chapter. And in that kind of context, it's extremely worrying, because when we get to a stage like that, which is what I think we're entering, and why I don't think that this last round is over, it's much harder to see exit strategies. It's much harder to see off ramps like Iran and Israel gave each other over the decades of shadow war.
So the shadow war has existed for a long time now. Proxy groups have been fighting on the side of Iran against Israel in their own way, while Gaza continued to be bombed and destroyed for nearly 2 years. Has this been Israel's plan all along? I discussed this with independent Israeli analyst Ori Goldberg. Let's fast forward to recent history. We've seen Israel's bombardment of Gaza, which Hamas is seen as an ally or linked to Iran. We have seen, obviously, the killing of Hassan Nasrallah. The Syrian regime fell completely, and it was, of course, very closely linked to Iran. Was this Israel's kind of plan since the beginning to weaken Iran's friends and allies and proxies so that it can conduct the strikes that we saw on the 13th of June?
If it was the plan, then it was very poorly executed because Israel didn't do a great deal during this 12-day war. Israel hasn't significantly weakened the Islamic Republic. Israel hasn't significantly damaged or hampered Iran's nuclear program. So I think that demonstrates that this probably wasn't a strategic plan that began with Iran's partners on Israel's borders and later expanded to Iran. I think Israel's handling of Hamas and Hezbollah was very specific to Hamas and Hezbollah. I don't think Israel played a tremendous role in the fall of the Assad regime. I think the Assad regime was rotten to the core. All that played a much bigger part in developments in Syria than any kind of Israeli grand design. And the reason is I think Israel doesn't do grand design well. I think this strike on Iran was planned meticulously at the tactical operative level, and I think Iran was very much permeable to Israeli intelligence efforts. Obviously, Israel had a great many assets in Iran that operated inside the country as this strike was being carried out. But I think that this strike was very Israeli. It was very typically Israeli. Yes, the fighters bombed. The heart of the initial strike was the assassinations, which is what Israel prides itself on. And I don't think there was anything particularly sophisticated there in any way that exceeds blowing up buildings and killing bad guys. I think what Israel wants is the freedom to disrupt. I don't think Israel has any clear strategic vision about its relationships with the countries that share its borders or even with Iran.
Was it just to disrupt, as you said, the nuclear talks?
No, I don't think it was just to disrupt the nuclear talks. There's a broader cause of disruption. Israel doesn't want talks. Israel doesn't want the Middle East regulated by diplomacy. Israel wants to have full discretion and full legitimacy to do whatever it wants, whenever it wants, for as long as it wants, without paying any cost. And it's constantly driving home this point.
After that call from President Trump to Netanyahu on that day, the infamous day that the ceasefire was declared, then broken, then declared again, Israel suddenly said that it had achieved its goals in Iran. But yet 2 years later in Gaza, the goals seemingly have not been achieved. Gaza is way smaller than Iran. It is not a state, does not have state capabilities. The enemy is simply not as big. So what is the point of all of this? Could there really not be a big strategy?
I think it's a little different in the case of Gaza because Israel has a particular issue with the Palestinians. Israel would feel the most secure if the Palestinians are simply not here. That doesn't mean that Israel wants to kill all the Palestinians. It just means that it wants them to know their place or to leave. But look at what Israel has done in Gaza over the past 2 years. Israel's done everything. Israel has used all of its power. It has bombed, it has demolished, it has destroyed, and it has not managed to realize the goals that it set itself. Hamas has not been destroyed and the hostages have not been returned. I live in Israel. I know the Israeli mindset. I'm looking at the way Israel has been acting in Gaza over the past 2 years, and I really can't identify any kind of concentrated effort to realize or to fulfill any kind of orderly plan, because what Israel is doing in Gaza is a mess. It's a remarkably bloody mess, but it's a mess, and it's a cowardly mess as well, because Israel's bombing from the air. So the Palestinian issue is a little different than the Iranian issue because Israel really no longer feels secure with the Palestinians physically being there. But even in this case, even within this framing, Israel doesn't appear to be anything particularly methodical. I don't see this grand plan.
So let's talk about the political fallout. We were reading headlines that we never thought we would read. Iranian missiles strike in the heart of Tel Aviv. Like, we never imagined this. It's the first time that Israel had ever been hit so extensively. But now that it's actually happened, what was the political fallout from the Iran retaliation on Israel when it comes to the Israeli government? Did this help bolster the prime minister's popularity, credibility, or did it worsen it?
I wish I could say that the fallout was criticism of the government. and a greater empathy towards the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza, or just an awareness of the horrors of such a bombing campaign. It wasn't. For 20, 25 years, we've grown up with the notion that Iran was Israel's existential enemy and that the only thing the Iranians ever wanted was to destroy Israel. So inevitably, we were going to go to war with Iran. And the fact that Netanyahu did it, nobody likes Netanyahu that much, but you got to hand it to him. Even people like Netanyahu know a right cause when they see it, and he embraced it, and it was a historic victory.
So in Israel, this is perceived as a win because it is perceived as Israel conducting successful strikes that have really hindered Iran's nuclear capabilities by at least a few years. And we will rinse and repeat until we talk about this again on the podcast 4 years from now, 3 years from now, or even next year, when Israel kind of decides that Iran has moved its nuclear program forward. Is this the case?
Can I wax philosophical for a second? The profound problem in Israel right now is that nothing manages to stick, not the positive vibes and not the negative vibes. It's as though everything we do and everything that happens to us is carved in ice and ultimately melts. And that's true about the bad things, like 7 Israeli soldiers dying in the Gaza Strip, as it is about the good things. There's no follow-up. There's no attempt to learn. There's no sense of how all of these specific events fit into some kind of grand picture. How does this victory in Iran lead us towards the future? We don't care. We care about the fact that we attacked Iran and we established superiority. Who cares about the future? Israelis have stopped caring about the future. Living in a society where this is the general state of affairs is very bad. It's not conducive to life. You can't really live if you have no vision of the future. And that's where Israel is. So yes, it was a win. It was a historic win. And we're going to have to fight again, obviously, because all the Iranians want to do is destroy us. And we love peace, if only we were let alone, but we're not. So what choice do we have? It's the same as it was in Gaza. But what is our future? We don't care. We don't care if the world denounces us. We don't care if the world ostracizes us. We have to do what we have to do, and we have to do it now. Consequences be damned.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week. Visit thenationalnews.com for more on this, for analysis, and what comes next for Iran, Israel, and the wider region. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Du'a Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. But one more thing before you go. We want to hear from you. Help us improve our podcast by taking our 2-minute listener survey. You can find the link in the episode's show notes. Thank you for listening.